So I've given the title Homophobia, Racism and the Contemporary Mission of the Church of England, a reflection from pastoral experience. And I just wanted to start, first of all, by saying that this little series of lectures was really rather quickly put together for LGBTIA History Month, because Jane and Mark contacted me because of a little sort of social media furore that I had the mid to late January about issues around LGBTQIA lives and safeguarding in the Diocese of London. And they contacted me and said, and offered support and indeed help if they wanted offer. So this is how this little series has been precipitated. I did want to have another speaker who wasn't a Christian, Andrew Thompson, who's the chief executive of the Humanist UK, who is also gay and a bit of an expert on the legal issues around sexuality and how they've changed. But he was unfortunately not able to do the dates that emerged. I wanted Andrew to address the issue of the history of national government legislation in relation to sexuality and marriage, and to give us that broader legal context from someone who was very definitely not a part of the church. And I think it would have also been really interesting to have Andrew with us tonight, because I know that Andrew would have entered into a very critical dialogue with Mark's thoughts from last week, which I think would have been interesting and probably a bit explosive. I'm absolutely sure that Andrew wouldn't have accepted Mark's premise that the church was in any way progressively ahead of society at all in the post-war period to the mid-60s on the lives that we're addressing in this series. Rather, I think he would argue that the main voices of change were coming from outside the church. And although the church may well have been internally more progressive in this period, and as Mark was pointing out last week, within a natural law tradition, not talking about the Bible very much in relation to LGBTQIA plus lives, and indeed did advocate for change, that was probably only significant because of the more prominent role that it played both within society at large at the time and within the legislature in the House of Lords. But I think Andrew's main point would no doubt have been that those who really precipitated change were not Christians, but probably people like himself. Such an argument reminds me also of the ways in which the life and work of James Baldwin, who as a queer Black person and thinker personifies some of the intersections that I'm hoping to raise this evening, can become colonized by those of us who want to make our own points from wherever we at presently stand. So Baldwin is simultaneously brought into play as a humanist by humanists and as a Christian by Christian thinkers. We had a little spat about that in the vicarage at one point last year. And Tom Holland and Dominion, of course, reminds us that such easy labelling and distinctions are not really to be made and can't be made historically. And one wonders what Baldwin would have made of his appropriation by different parts of society and philosophical and theological schools. So here we are tonight, and in that context, I see myself as I'm not a historian of religion nor an academic theologian like Mark and Jane, but I hope that in the metaphor of being the light sorbet, that we might do some cleaning of our taste buds. Well, my ministerial history and location are therefore at the centre of my thoughts this evening, because I haven't existed in the academy for all of my ministry. And rather they emanate from the pastoral and missional life of the church as it has been lived out in my experience. My entire ministry has been within the Diocese of London, first in a parish as a curate, and then for 18 years in the context of healthcare chaplaincy, with Sunday attachments to various parishes, and then for the last 2.5 years here in this parish in Kilburn and West Hampstead. And on this Ash Wednesday, as we enter into this penitential season, which is yet also joyful, a season in which we are called to discipline and preparation and to observe and to relive the great paschal mystery of God's redemption of all created things in Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. I want to start by a confession of my own muddled thinking and living in relation to race in particular, and the intersections of race and sexuality, and plot a little bit of the development. Father Stephanus Pedrano is a Benedictine monk and a priest at Prince of Peace Abbey in Oceanside in California. And he reminds us, even liberals or progressives can be stupid racists. One such man misunderstood something I wrote, and he tried to disagree with me. I explained what I wrote. Then he blamed his misunderstanding on my not having English as my first language. And when I told him English is my first language, he said my picture and my name misled him. My picture and my name did not mislead him. His stupidity and his racism did. Well, I was brought up in the extremely undiverse rural north of Ireland. There were only 3 people in my school who were not white. They were Chinese children and the children of the owner of the Chinese restaurant in town. I think it's slightly more diverse these days. There is an Indian restaurant as well now. King's College, Cambridge, where I went to, wasn't really that much diverse either. There were a few black and brown people in college, but none at all in my year in the divinity faculty. And then when I went to Ripon College, Cuddesdon, that was even less diverse. It was completely white, I think, for the whole of the 2 years I was there. There wasn't even an exchange student from another part of the Anglican Communion to mix it up a bit. And then I went to Ruislip, which is in Zone 6 London suburb, where I served as curate at St Martin's Church. And at that time, there was an electoral roll of 700, but there were only 2 brown or black families. Ruislip sort of was a little bit like England in the 1950s still. It had lots and lots of parade masses and with the paramilitary organisations, as I called them, coming with their Union Jacks, something which I've never felt particularly happy with. So it was only really when I moved into healthcare chaplaincy after Ruislip that both the people I worked with and those who were patients became much more diverse. And I was based first at a hospice and mental health unit for large parts of northwest London, and then at a hospital that is a specialised regional centre for the entire southeast of England. And these geographical expanses are, of course, very different from the north of Ireland, Cambridge, Cuddesdon, or Ruislip. In contrast to this, however, at the same time, for 8 years on Sundays, I helped out in Putney Parish, which, being Oxbridge on the River Thames, is not really that diverse either. And then for another 8 years, I was an associate at St George's, Camden Hill, with St John's Holland Road, which is just sandwiched between Holland Park Avenue and Kensington High Street. And about 20% of the parishioners there were black or brown, but it being the parish that it was, these were the international rich, most of them in banking or the diplomatic service, and most of them had tied accommodation, which happened to be located in the parish. In 2010, I became more active in the local Labour Party in Kensington and Chelsea, however, and I began to realise that there was a whole world north of Holland Park Avenue, which was really very diverse and filled with people from all parts of the world. Such people I had only really worked with as individuals or as families in the healthcare context. But being more politically active meant that I was beginning to know many more black and brown people, both within the Labour Party and socially, and to know people as part of communities which I increasingly had access to and indeed could be seen to be a part of. In fact, when I'm just talking about that,
the head's oiled up.
I'm reminded, somebody needs to go on mute. When I'm talking about that, I'm reminded of a lecture that I heard Rowan Williams give, which was to what was called the London Clergy Synod. And he said that churches were the most diverse places in London, and that was simply not my experience. My experience throughout the whole of my time in London has been that the Labour Party meetings are very definitely the most diverse place to be. In 2014, I stood for election in Kensington and Chelsea for Dalgarno ward, and I was elected. It's in the northwest of the borough, and I served in that ward until February 2019. According to the last census, which of course is really completely out of date now, we're going to have a census this year, so the census is 10 years old. Dalgarno is not as ethnically or religiously diverse as many places in London, but it's certainly the most ethnically and religiously diverse place until I came here that I've been a part of, although I didn't actually live in the ward. Dalgarno was 51% Christian, 15% Muslim, but of course, in terms of actually what you saw and actually people who practiced, that actually meant it felt much more Muslim than Christian in a way. 20% of people had no religion. It was dominated by a number of really large housing estates, with 65% of the residents living in social housing, 24% in private rented, and only 21% being owner-occupied. 13% of Dalgarno's residents experience overcrowding, which is almost twice the London average. And overcrowding here essentially means that you don't have a functioning living room. I'd say in my ward, about 50% of families with children of school age didn't have a functioning living room because they had to use the living room as an extra bedroom, because you needed to be 2 people overcrowded in order to go on the list to be rehoused by the borough. And the statistics for household deprivation, which covers 4 areas, employment, education, health, disability and housing, put Dalgarno ward in the bottom 10 most deprived wards in London. And it's even starker than it seems, because these indices of deprivation are cumulative. So Dalgarno, there were 33.6% of houses had one dimension of deprivation, but 25.6% had 2, 12.6% had 3, and 1.5% had all 4. And only 27% of households in Dalgarno were not deprived in any of those dimensions. And that was the little bit of Dalgarno, that borders on St Helens, which is owner-occupied, because the next street just outside of my ward was where David Cameron had his London house. But the most depressing thing, I think, in Dalgarno was the levels of educational attainment. It was the lowest number of residents in any borough in London that attained 5 good GCSEs. In 2016, I also crossed the Rubicon of Holland Park Avenue, which cuts North Kensington from South Kensington, for my Sunday parish affiliation, and I began to help out in the parish of St James Norland and St Clement's Notting Dale. And Notting Dale as a ward is less deprived, but more diverse than Dalgarno. There's only 45% of people who are ethnically white. 75% of people live in social housing, and the Church Urban Fund ranks it in the bottom 7% of parishes in the country on measurements of poverty. And if you compare this to the former parish that I helped out in, St George's and St John's, on the other side of Holland Avenue, you can just see how acute the levels of inequality in Kensington and Chelsea were and still are. And this might give you some background to really quite a lot of the animosity that surfaced after the Grenfell fire, because these were, what the Grenfell fire brought to the surface was ongoing inequalities that existed within the borough as a whole. So the 2 parishes actually border on one another, one north, one south of Holland Park Avenue. But in St George and St John's, there was only 6% of people who lived in social housing. And of those who attended church, 95% of them were in the top 0.5 income earners in the country. So the new parish in which I helped out and the churches were completely different. And it was the first time that I'd ever worshipped in a context with significant numbers of people from Caribbean and African origins. St Clement's, which is directly below Grenfell Tower, was a Black majority community with about 70% of people who came to Sunday Mass on a Sunday being Black. And the vast majority of our Black parishioners were either first or second generation immigrants from the Caribbean. It was Notting Hill was a very Caribbean area rather than African. And in fact, most of the African immigrants now into North Kensington are mostly Muslim. So you don't really have the propensity of African Christians within North Kensington as you do in other parts of London. Because I'd only ever served in almost virtually completely white and indeed really very affluent communities and very liberal parishes, I was really quite surprised that I was a bit worried about going to essentially what was a Black majority church, mainly because of stereotypes that I had about how they might receive somebody like myself who is an openly gay priest. And I suppose here is my Ash Wednesday confession that even I, as a progressive, made a really racist assumption, which came from my lack of knowledge of the community at St Clement's, of Black British families in general, and probably formed by reading too much of the gay press, which of course concentrates on the persecution of batty boys in Jamaica, as well as a bit of the poetry of the Jamaican poet Kay Miller, who's really wonderful, but who sometimes sort of sees himself as a refugee from Jamaica because of his sexuality. And my prejudgment was also formed from lack of knowledge about the experience of the actual migration and settling of the Black families in our community and in general in North Kensington. The fact was that none of the Black British people at St Clement's had any problem at all with sexuality, mine or anyone else's. And this arose because of the particularity of their own personal histories of arrival in and around Notting Hill and of finding a home to worship at St Clement's. I'm going to give the name Hazel to one of these parishioners. She really is becoming a totemic parishioner that represents the voice of many of the parishioners. And Hazel is an older woman in her 80s, one of the aunties of the church. And in her animated drill, Jamaican drill, she would tell the story of going to church on the very first Sunday after she'd arrived in London to the parish just north of St Clement's. It was literally during the processional hymn that the vicar stopped right by her on his way to the sanctuary and suggested that there would be other churches nearby that would, quotes, unquotes, be more suitable for Hazel to attend. And Hazel left, and she said she burst into tears outside. And what she said was, I was Church of England all my life, because the Anglican Church in the Caribbean was the Church of England, still called the Church of England then. And was this not the Church of England of which I was a part? Eventually Hazel, and many people like her, found a home at St Clement's. And the vicar of St Clement's at the time was Father David Randall, who was, by all accounts, an extraordinary, ebullient, friendly, open, extremely entrepreneurial, and indeed an openly gay priest, even in the 1970s and 1980s. And locally, David was known as the priest who simply accepted people for who they were and welcomed Black people into the community of which he had oversight. And some of the old aunties and uncles at St Clement's would tell me, well, of course, Father David, being gay, knew what it was to be rejected and to be marginalised. He knew what it was to be ostracised and excluded. And it was because he was gay that he knew what we felt and could feel our pain. And that's the reason why he made St Clement's a place of welcome. Nor was Father David someone who simply imposed white English culture upon those from the Caribbean islands whom he had welcomed into the body of Christ in that place. Rather, he delighted in the cultural diversity that they brought, the cultural dialogue, conversation, and exchange that their presence enabled to happen. The most colourful example of this is the Carnival Mass, which still occurs every Sunday of Notting Hill Carnival on the bank holiday weekend in August. David decided very early on in his time at St Clement's that the parish should have a float in the carnival as well. So he went off with some of the younger black women at the time, now the aunties of the parish. I think it was to St Lucia, but I can't quite remember. And he went there for over a month to learn how to design and make costumes for Carnival. And every year since then, there's been a 3-week children's holiday club during the school holidays in the summer, which local children from whatever background they come design and make their costumes, and they choreograph their dance. And on the Sunday of Carnival itself, they come into church, and we replace the Liturgy of the Word with their performance, which is generally based on some biblical theme. And it is the highlight of the year at St Clement's. It is the church service that is the most highly attended, much bigger than any of the religious festivals. And it feels really special because it's so off the parish and embedded in the lives and cultures of the majority of people who worship there. And increasingly, actually, and this is another aspect of race that I think we probably don't address in the church. I mean, increasingly, the children who take part in that holiday club come from Muslim backgrounds as well. So you would get quite a lot of Muslim families in church on Carnival Sunday, for Carnival Mass as well. The impact of Father David on the parish, with his careful attention to the cultural and social realities of the families who came to worship at St Clement's, is, however, much greater than this as well. David realised that the material reality for most of his black families mirrored, although was worse than, those of the local white working class families. And the socio-economic condition for many in terms of housing meant that there was much overcrowding, which was completely then, and still is, very detrimental to the well-being and flourishing of the young parishioners. David was particularly concerned with the impact that this had on the educational attainment of children. And these were children, if you've watched Steve McQueen's Small Acts, which in the episode on education, which is called Education, were already very highly likely to be labelled and treated as educationally subnormal. And this propensity to underrate the intelligence of black children coalesced with the fact that many of them then came home from school to physical spaces in which it was impossible to have any privacy, to read or to study. And then we have a whole spiral of problems which comes from both of those meeting together. Because of this, David opened up the church hall every day, and he started a homework club for the children. And these homework clubs also, in effect, were the first of the supplementary schools, which we also see in Steve McQueen's Education, of the local North Kensington area, in which children were helped, mostly by black adult volunteers, with their schoolwork. And this was bolstered with learning about the history, literature, culture, music, politics, etc. of Africa and the Caribbean. And David's legacy here still exists within the parish, and in fact it's gone sort of national. A future vicar, youth worker and parishioner of the parish expanded this into what is now locally the present Clement James Centre, and Clement James offers 4 different strands of help to local residents. One arising out of the homework club is now called Into University, which has a national overall organisation. One is called Into Work, which helps younger people who don't come from backgrounds where they might even be able to have a suit and tie to go for a job interview, to have those, to do interview practice, and all the things that are necessary in order to make it a good impact at a job interview. And the national charity was formed by Hugh Raymond Pickard, Claire Richards and Rachel Carr in 2002. And Into University, which is the national organisation now, has 31 learning centres and projects throughout the country, and it enters into partnership with local universities in order, with lots of universities having access goals. And this is a direct legacy of the Homework Club that Father David started for the Black children that were in the parish at the time. But there's another part of Father David's story, which means that we need to move from small acts to Russell T Davies' It's a Sin. Because when the AIDS virus hit gay men in London in the 1980s and people started to become ill and to die, David felt that the parish should also respond at the time. And if you've watched the series, you will have seen graphically the forced isolation and almost incarceration that AIDS patients had to endure during treatment at the end of their lives because of the fear of infection that others had. David, however, had no such qualms at all, and he somehow convinced the parish council that the lower church halls would be opened up as a hospice for the gay men that were dying of AIDS. And this was to be a place of love, care, and compassion in which they were not quarantined, but treated with dignity and respect. And many of the parishioners, black and white, served as volunteers here. And lots of the older people still have memories and talk about that particular period in the parish's life. David then had a vision to open up a purpose-built building, and he networked and got a group together, raised funds, and built what became known as the Lighthouse, which was the first AIDS hospice in London, which was just off Ladbroke Grove on Lancaster Road, just a bit up from St Clement's Church. David was one of the founding trustees of the Lighthouse. It's no longer, obviously, an AIDS hospice, but you can still go and visit it. It is now the Museum of Brands, and you can go and have a think through about the history of branding and marketing. David himself, by all accounts, and this isn't just from his friends, some of whom I know, but also from parishioners, was also pretty sexually active and not that discreet about it either. Hazel still talks animatedly of the wonderful parties that would be thrown at the vicarage, and how David seemed to go through quite a few young men, and there were always different ones around. David himself, in the end, contracted AIDS, and he became terminally ill, and he ended his life in the hospice that he and his black, brown, and white parishioners, his friends, and his network had helped to find. The first time that I was told the story of David was very early on in my time at St Clement's, when his name came up in the year's mind, which is when the names are the list of people who died in that week are in the pew sheet, and they're prayed for, and people are asked to pray for them. Annually, when David's name was read out, there was a complete change in the emotional temperature at Mass. It was really, really palpable. There would be sobbing and wailing and extempore prayer offered for the repose of David's soul. And David was really, I think, an openly gay saint to the people of that parish, and also to the Caribbean people of the people who came from the Caribbean in that parish. And he was a saint because he offered them the hospitality and love of Christ with an open heart and outstretched arms when neighbouring Christian communities simply didn't. In the final stage of David's life, what we might see as his Holy Week, as he approached death, the love that he'd shown to his community was reciprocated back to him, and the Caribbean parishioners they put a rota together where they had a rota either to bring him gin or rum punch, which apparently was his preferred liquid to take his medication with. The very recent history of Father David Randall and of the Black parishioners of St Clement's and Nottingdale is, I think, a real case study in the intersection of sexuality and race that has affected and challenged me personally. And I want now to maybe try and sketch a few things out of that history that I have learnt, and also from my representation of Dalgarno Ward. This is probably not quite as complete as I wanted it to be, so I may go completely extempore at some point and add quite a few things. Well, in the first place, racism, such as my liberal and progressive version of it even, can only be countered by meeting real people and being exposed to real people's lives, their stories, their passions, their interests, their culture. And on my part, it was simply lack of knowledge and lack of experience, lack of exposure to those histories and the complexities and ambiguities of the diverse colourfulness of ordinary Black human beings in that parish that led me even to think at first that because people were from the Caribbean, that they were therefore going to be homophobic. Easy stereotyping and labelling were simply challenged by the histories of real people in a concrete and particular community, with the dynamics that were affected there by David's ministry and by the way in which the parishioners there had a relationship with David. A second observation from this history is that whilst racism and homophobia have their own particular histories and expressions, there is a degree of commonality in the experience of those who fail to live up to what we might see as the ideal human person that might be posited in any culture. And this enables real solidarity to take place between people who suffer from different forms of discrimination. The lack of parishioners at St. Clement's made a direct, the fact that parishioners at St. Clement's made a direct connection between David's experience of his own sexuality and the discrimination that arose out of that, with his ability, willingness, and desire to embrace them, people of different colour, on fully equal terms, I think is really significant. Not all gay people or vicars, then or now, I would presume, have, of course, done what David did, nor are all gay people or gay vicars not racist. But what is significant for me here is that it's because of his hospitality that any initial concerns about David's very obvious sexuality simply collapsed for people that you might otherwise have thought might have had a problem with it. And they were the ones that made that connection themselves. In the third place, this story is, for me, a concrete example of how it's simply utterly impossible to isolate one strand of a person's identity, which precipitates experience of discrimination and prejudice, from the multiple and layered nature of our complex, nuanced, and plural identities and selves. The story of the Black and brown people of North Kensington cannot be extracted from the socioeconomic realities of their lives. Racism is simply not just about race, but it's displayed in the structures that operate within our society. To tackle racism, you have to tackle health, educational, and housing inequalities. The parish of St. George's and St. John's on the other side of Holland Avenue was fairly diverse, and no one there would have said or thought that they were racist. But the Black and brown people there were the privileged exception to the rule, and a real contrast to the reality of what life was like for most Black and brown people in our church, in the parish on the other side of Holland Park Avenue, and indeed within this city and within our country at large. Moreover, the people in that community, of whatever colour, in St. George's and St. John's, benefited from a system that kept the more diverse others north of the avenue in their place. Fourthly, and arising and addressing the sexuality side of this evening's intersection, the same is true of homophobia in culture, society, and in the church. It is, of course, now much mitigated in society at large, But those of us who are LGBTQIA+ in the church experience not just some casual form of prejudice and discrimination, but are victimized by entire systems that have theological foundations and practical ecclesiological expressions. In regard to race, we may be beginning to get there just about a bit. The formation of the Archbishop's Task Force on Racism and what it will address and propose, we hope will deliver some of the systemic policy changes that are necessary here. However, for me, it's notable that the response to the George Floyd murder in the London diocese, we were all enjoined as clergy to read Ben Lindsay's book on racism. And this contrasts, I think, for me, with complete lack of engagement in the diocese with Azariah Franz Williams's ghostship. Ben Lindsay's book, of course, offers us a view of race that is generally focused more on how we treat individual Black people. And while there is some sort of social and systemic aspect to it, that's not as prevalent or as thoroughgoing as it is in Azariah's book. The other aspect, of course, of Ben's book is that Ben is not from within the diocese or from within the Church of England. And so it's easier probably to read a criticism of racism in general, rather than what I think Azariah's book is, which is a criticism of racism within the Church of England in particular, and actually more problematically for the Diocese of London, a criticism of racism and the structures that support racism within the HTB network, of which Azariah was a part, and the Kensington Episcopal area, in which Azariah served the entirety of his ministry within London, which is essentially sold over to the HTB church planting agenda. Particularly, and this arises out of my engagement with Azariah's book again, and indeed, I should probably say at this point that I know Azariah as a person, because Dalgarno Ward was also where Azariah worked. Azariah was the minister in charge of St. Francis Dalgarno Way, which was the only church, in fact, was the only place of worship of any kind within my ward. And at that point, he was on the staff of Holy Trinity Brompton. And this was sort of the outlie of Holy Trinity Brompton. It's not exactly, as you could tell from my description of the ward, a typical place in which HTB do any of their church planting. And I think for Azariah, you may get a sense of it in the book, there was the impact of living in that context socioeconomically, which was very different from the context in which other people in the HTB network were ministering in, meant that the whole HTB agenda of success in terms of numerical growth was simply not something that was going to happen in St. Francis Dalgarno Way for lots of really, really big reasons. I think one of the issues here for me is that I was very conscious when I was the ward councillor for Dalgarno that at least 35% of the population of Dalgarno were also in some form of either short-term or long-term mental health care. The significant population of Muslims within the area also raises issues around the type of mission that's possible in an area like that. And I think it's one of the aspects in the church's discussion of racism that is often missing, because you can't talk about race as an issue within the church, and the church cannot talk about race as an issue within society unless we also address issues of how we relate to people of other faith. Because increasingly in the north of Kensington, relating to people of a different race is relating to people who also have a different faith. And this is because, obviously, Mrs. Thatcher got rid of the right to succession in social housing, which has a completely detrimental effect on the cohesion of local working class communities of any colour. And it means that there's a rapid turnover in every generation of people who live in social housing. which means, of course, in somewhere like North Kensington, the original Caribbean migrants have to move out at some point, and that's why they move further north into Harlesden, Willesden, and places like that in the second generation. And then what happens is that those properties are then taken over by new immigrants who increasingly are Muslim. For Azariah, I think, and you can also plot this in his book, his own faith development arose out of thinking through not just race as an issue, but the socio-economic deprivation of the area in which we both worked. This raises really big questions, I think, for how we address race in the church, and it also raises questions in relation to sexuality. Because the HTB model of church planting has, in a sense, been exported to virtually every single diocese in the Church of England now. In London Diocese, it has really taken over completely. 6 of the present bishops are part of the HTB network. And the way in which we perceive mission is very much structured by the way in which HTB perceives mission. And racism is part of the problem here because race isn't factored into how they want the church to grow, or in general, the focus is on increasing numerical numbers, and that is the main focus, and that is seen to be the gospel, and that is seen to be what mission is all about. But that actually doesn't allow fuller reflection on the other aspects of mission, or in terms of the Anglican Communion, the 5 marks of mission. It seems to me that the present church is really focused on only one of the strands of the Anglican Communion's marks of mission, and that has led to our problems around race and sexuality being exacerbated greatly. Then I think this is true of how the HTB network deal with the issues of sexuality. And I suppose to give some background and context to my own little social media spat, which has rather been eclipsed by Jarell Robinson-Brown's much greater media impact after that, I started tweeting and on social media and retweeting a blog by Rachel Gillingham. And Rachel Gillingham is someone who I've been in pastoral relationship in this parish with for the entire time I've been here. Rachel worshipped at St Luke's Kentish Town, which is a HTB church plant within this deanery. And when she came out as a lesbian, it became problematic. It became problematic in that she was a house group leader, and there was a review done of essentially the job description of house group leaders, and it was felt that she would not be suitable to be a house group leader. Now, it was never made completely clear whether that was simply to do with her sexuality or whether that was to do with concerns that the clergy team had about what Rachel was putting out in social media in terms of affirming theology and inclusive theology. And in fact, I think what probably happens within many churches, like St Luke's Kentish Town, is that homophobia is never directly expressed, but it is indirectly expressed. So that the position of Rachel within that parish context, in that plant context, was made so uncomfortable that she resigned as a house group leader, which of course meant the parish could say that they didn't actually sack her or dismiss her from that position because she was gay. And here, I think, is something which is at the heart of how the church deals with the issue of sexuality, which is duplicity. There's a duplicity at the heart of how St Luke's Kentish Town presented itself. And indeed, in some of the comments when Rachel put her blogs on Facebook, some of the people that she worshipped with at St Luke's Kentish Town actually said, gosh, when you were leading worship, I felt this was a wonderful place to be because you were so obviously lesbian and this was a really vibrant worshipping community. The perception that some people have of these types of liturgical worship are that they present themselves as completely affirming on issues in human sexuality. And it's only when you cut beneath the surface that you find out that that is not the case at all. And then I suppose this perhaps brings me to my last point. I don't think that you can blame the HTB network simply for that duplicity, because that duplicity around sexuality is something that we all own in the Church of England, and it is really set by the tone of the House of Bishops and the College of Bishops. And I think that perhaps the one major thing that we need to do, not just for the sexuality issue, but for all of the issues that we discuss within the Church of England, is to reform the Episcopacy. It needs a complete overhaul. For those of us who've reached my stage of ministry, I'll be 50 this year, I know people in the House of Bishops who are gay. I know people in the House of Bishops who are completely affirming and supportive of an inclusive church, but who, because they're in the House of Bishops, feel, or, well, no, it's not even feel, are actually constrained from speaking about it. What we have on this particular issue, therefore, is not good, open, and honest debate, but we have a system in which we choose bishops, which essentially rewards sycophancy and rewards silence on controversial issues, and does not allow critical voices of challenge. And the reform of the Episcopacy seems to me to be really important for the renewal of the church. And then finally, I think I'd like to broaden out that issue, because a theology of the Episcopacy is part of an ecclesiology in general. And it seems to me that one of the problems that the present Church of England has is that we really don't know what we are as a church, and we don't have an ecclesiology which is shared by everyone. This was brought home to me by Bishop Sarah when she became Bishop of London, and she was going around the deaneries. Bishop Sarah gave a wonderful sort of spiel on the Acts of the Apostles, saying how in the Acts of the Apostles they prayed together, they broke bread together, and day by day people were being saved. I think her whole reason for doing that was that she had felt that probably the Diocese of London for the last 5 years was concentrated on numerical increase and people being saved, and she wanted to broaden that out into the other three aspects. I asked a question which precipitated a really revealing answer. I said, well, we're not a church in which we don't have common orders, because we have a system in which we have alternative episcopal oversight for those who cannot accept the ordination of women. And we also have a church in which we no longer have a common liturgy. There is the sense in which I think the Church of England has been held together since the Elizabethan period, because even though there were diverse theologies, we actually worshipped in all the same way. But in the last 25 years, that's been completely undermined by liturgical changes, or indeed the abandonment of liturgy completely in some parts of the church, which means that we don't pray together in the same way at all. And then thirdly, and I think this is a really big issue for me, is that in the Diocese of London, we abandoned a redistributive common fund, which has meant that really rich parishes are able to keep their own money and to dictate to the diocese how the diocese should develop. And that's why we've got into the situation that we have. Essentially, I think in the Diocese of London now, we operate as two parallel churches. There are those people who are parts of the networks of planting churches who are extremely well staffed. And then there's the rest of us who I call the ordinary diocesan clergy, who are in parishes that can be quite tough, always poorer, always the most racially diverse parishes, and yet we are completely stretched in how we are meant to fulfill our ministries. And finally, this is really finally now, I think I've said finally a lot. I think the problem that we've got to in relation to sexuality in the Church of England is that because we no longer have common orders, we no longer have common worship, we no longer have a redistributive common fund, the only thing that we have in common is that we're all meant to sign up to issues in human sexuality. And that's a lie.